You've been walking through the desert sands for days. You've crossed the red sands and the blue sands, the green sands and the purple sands. You've crossed dunes after dunes. Finally, in the distance, you see the tree of life, colossal, a huge towering object. Sparkling within it are the lights of the city you are trying to get to. In the distance, through the haze, you see fins coming towards you, through the sand. Before you know it, you're surrounded by sand sharks. Roll for initiative.
Welcome, everybody. This is a talk that Marc and I have been wanting to do for quite a while. So, myths and Heptaverses, building worlds worth exploring. Myths is Marc's forte, as you just heard. Heptaverses, which is kind of stuff that I create, super sci-fi stuff, is what I do. And we're joining forces, and we're going to tell you everything we know. So, our handles will always be at the bottom right. Marc is Old Loths, I'm Endesga, and yeah. Sweet. So this is a conversational discussion, and we're basically just, it's going to be quite casual, but if you have any questions, just keep them to yourselves, and we're going to have a...
We will not be answering them.
Yeah. But at the very end, we'll be talking about a lot of things, and if we've got enough time, hopefully we'll do some other things too.
So basically the way this works, like, because we're both really into world building, but we have very different opinions of like a lot of things. And like, there's no like one truth. There's always so many ways of doing things. So we're just going to be like bouncing back and forth, like kind of giving our own opinions and like just confusing everyone, hopefully. Yeah.
So, so we'll start with how to world build. There's basically two ways. You either go from the inside out, so micro to macro, or macro to micro.
So like, so what this means, like, it depends what you're making your world for. So if you're, say, for example, making a world for a sort of short narrative game, you're going to need probably a plot. A plot is good. So you kind of start with a plot, or like a character, a little seed, and you kind of grow out from that seed. So you're like, oh, well, where does this character live? Like, where are they from? Like, what is this place? And then your world kind of grows from there. Whereas with the outside in, that's Seth's thing.
So my way is kind of the opposite. So I sort of think things in more of a holistic sense. And for example, my universes that I've created, I literally start with the universe. I'm going, okay, when is it and where does it go? And I sort of work my way down until I get down to the planets and the people and the languages. And so there's just two different ways. They both work. And just find the one that works best for you. So. Reason without explanation.
So everything...
Oops. Clicked the wrong button.
Technical difficulty. Everything there is in your world has a reason. So like it's always an endless like chain of cause and effect. Like something happens which causes this, which causes this, which causes this, which is always implied, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to tell everyone or you have to know it. It's just like this thing where you kind of have this feeling that there is like this underlying thing that you can dig into if you need to, but it doesn't have to be like written or prepared. Like take for example Kingdom Hearts, like that. I don't think anything that happens in like the last 5 games that they've released was planned when they started on the first one.
Yeah.
But
it's like, we'll just do this and see if people understand. Worlds are fractals. This is something that I definitely like as well because there's something smaller than what you have. So always, unless you're counting the Planck distance, but that's something else. So like if you have like a planet, there's obviously going to be continents, and then obviously in continents there's going to be like countries and people and da da da. It's just like everything is like a repeat, but there's lots of everything continuously growing smaller. So.
So at the same time, like kind of the complexity of the world should reflect what you're trying to do. Where it kind of goes into like the whole concept of you can write a simple story and tell it in a complex way, Kingdom Hearts, or you could write a complex story and tell it in a simple way, which is kind of like the opposite, which is really difficult to do. Or you could just go simple story, told simply, and it works for you. But like it just depends kind of what sort of feeling do you want the player to get from it, and like how do you want to get there?
Yeah. And you also got to show restraint because Don't do what I do and just continuously add things. It gets to a point where you're like, you can't keep track of it, and then you have like 50 notebooks, and you're going, okay, this is getting a little out of hand. So you got to show a little restraint, a little clarity on what's actually happening, because people will be reading it, people will be looking at it.
So this would be the point where you kind of like pull the rug over it, and you're like, this is something for later, for like the fourth sequel. We can dig into this then.
Yeah. So So where to start and questions to ask. You got to be curious. Definitely, that's possibly the biggest thing. Some people, might say, that, because people have asked me, like, how do I do it? And they, I'm just not curious. I'm going, everyone's curious. You're always wondering about something, so you can make it out of that. You got to ask what if, and
you got to find a seed. Like, that's kind of like I'm really a big believer in like the fact that like every sort of narrative world stems from a single seed that can be just like any idea. Like I recently built a world for a map that was just like based on this moon looks pretty. Like what if it wasn't there? And so you kind of like find this one thing and you start growing outwards from it. Yeah. And like so like moon's not there. Like what happens if there's no moon? Like and you kind of like ask these questions and try to answer them. And in the process, create more questions, and all of a sudden it's like 4 a.m. and you've just been like writing like a madman all night.
Yeah, so we've got some examples here, like, isn't it strange how, or what if was actually this, or like, how would things be if this was a particular way, and when would what happen if it was slightly different? So, yeah. So this kind of stems into the next bit, which is who, what, where, when, why, how, and should I? And basically, you ask yourself, like, should I do something? Should I actually be adding something to the world that I'm creating? Is it actually worth it? And if you should, then
you just go, well, who are we talking about? Like, who's this character? Where they're from? Like, well, maybe think about their childhood. Who are their friends? Like, where do they live? What did they have for breakfast? Like, all of these kind of seemingly unimportant questions that can lead to more stuff. So here's where like the kind of fractal comes in, where you're thinking about what did they have for breakfast? They had some like weird blue milk. Where did this weird blue milk come from?
Yeah. Right? So everything's interconnected. So yeah. And the pitfalls and how to bridge them, since you will obviously be creating a story and there's going to be gaps, there's going to be holes, and you need to find ways to actually like connect them, but also be aware that they might exist, and therefore. Like rabbit holes, plot holes, as I said, you got to keep a holistic view.
Yeah, well, like with the rabbit holes, you have to be really careful to not go too far down one of the branches of the fractal. Where as soon as you start, I'll mention this later on in a bit about tools as well. So like as soon as you start realizing that one of your branches is getting way too long, you have to really pull yourself back and kind of go, okay, well, this is not relevant anymore. We got to like move over to this thing.
So you got to constantly review things, make sure you're not messing up stuff, contradictions, all that sort of stuff. And so the best way to do this is to lay out core rules. So this might be fundamental things. If you've got a mythical world, maybe you have a certain amount of elements, fire, water, earth, whatever it may be, and those things can only interact in certain ways, and therefore those are rules. Even though it might be very light rules, but it's rules that can justify certain things. Skyrim is a great example for this, because they've got rules with magic and how that works, and that builds the structures. So next is hooks.
This one is like my personal favorite part. Where like you find a hook in everything you do in this world, where you might have, say, for example, from earlier, a desert, but the sand is like all rainbow colors, and you've got like this big tree that has like cities on it. So you kind of like take this one thing, and you're like, what can we change about this? What can we like introduce into this thing that makes it more interesting? So you kind of go like a desert, but. So you just kind of like play with people's expectations and sort of twist what they think they're getting into.
One of my favorite things are twisted hooks. So you might have something that like you expect it to do something in a particular way. Maybe the character's going somewhere and something happens. But then the thing that happens is a bit of a twist in itself, and it's completely unexpected. But that in itself becomes a hook because it links them into something else that's completely different. And they're going, whoa, that's really cool. Let's go down this path.
So like now that we've talked about like how to make it really interesting and alien and cool, we also have to
have anchors.
So these are kind of like your entry points. That's what keeps your world relatable. If you were to drop someone onto like this is like dark world full of spikes with like there's no humans. Like every creature has like 6 legs. It's really difficult to kind of get into and like show empathy and emotion towards these things that are happening. So these anchors are kind of like the sort of things where maybe there's a human colony in there, and suddenly you've got something to like ease yourself into, and then you kind of like go from there.
Yeah, one of the things I discovered while building my own game was the fact that like I wanted a way to anchor the player almost instantly, and obviously enough, I thought, well, why not make the first planet have green grass? And you land in this particular world, and it looks kind of like Earth. And that in itself is a huge anchor, because then they feel like they're part of this already, and they don't feel like they're dropped into somewhere completely random. They're like, I don't know what's going on. So comfort is definitely a huge one, because the player or whoever's experiencing the story needs to feel comfortable with what's going on, rather than just throwing them into the deep end and going, well, have fun. So that's why familiarity and relatability. So yeah, beyond the lore.
Yeah, so we can actually go like beyond just like telling a story with your world. You can, for example, find game mechanics inside the story. So you might have like powers that are based on one of the core rules of the world that you've laid out earlier. So perhaps like your world can be influenced by dreams. So how can you like? So you can start thinking about like how can you wrap a dream into a game mechanic that can then be used to influence things in your world, which kind of gives them a double layer of meaning as well, where you kind of you've taken this idea from the world, you've turned it into a mechanic, and now you're kind of like drawing it back like into the narrative.
Yeah, so you're creating links through the narrative to connect things up. Again, you might have a particular tool or a particular object that has a lot of history and lore connected to it, but therefore can also be part of the mechanic because it links with the world in another way. Again, another example in my own game, there's this particular tool that the player has, and so she uses it, but that tool has a huge history behind it, which is connected to part of the story, but it's part of the game as well, and therefore there's a direct link, which becomes a very tight bond between the player and the game and the experience in it.
It's a very useful way of like kind of finding these things. Because obviously, if you're going to like sit down on a computer and you're like, well, I'm going to like write a mechanic that's like, now I have the power of dreams. Like, how do you do that? So like, kind of stepping away from the keyboard for a little bit and just kind of playing it through the lens of tabletop RPGs works really well, because you can just come up with anything and you don't have to like do any work beyond that. You can just kind of go, yep, here's this thing that we can do now. Let's roll some dice, see what happens. And then you can refine it from there. And as soon as you've got kind of like a little nugget of something usable, you can then start implementing that in like a digital prototype and start working with that and refining from there.
Yeah, so, and the other part to it is lore reflected through the art. A lot of people don't really, from what I've seen, like you really got to focus on portraying some of the lore through the art as well. Just because you got a written story, visually displaying it is a completely different thing, because you can have, like if you imagine, let's say Skyrim was like a choose your own adventure text game. You'd have to imagine all these things in your head, which is totally valuable, but if you also have a vision of something, creating it and like painting it and making it a visual thing is also incredibly important. So yeah, lore reflected through the art. Even down to the nitty-gritty stuff like environmental lore, story narrative, stuff like that. Yep, so meaning, context, and the meta.
Yeah, so this is a really good way to kind of like strengthen the backbone of your world, where you work out from the seed, and you might already have an idea of like what your world is about thematically. So you might have an example of like, your world might be a commentary on climate change and that kind of thing. So where do you work from there? And then you're kind of working out your seed, building your world, and you might, through a happy accident, stumble upon something that works really well. Like I'm working on a thing at the moment that's like it started as this climate change thing, and I had this happy accident where I kind of like started getting these themes of like game distribution. And so I found that, I'm like, this is cool. So you kind of like drag it back and you double down on it and you see where else you can find this thing and like really bring it out.
And the other very important part is what you're trying to say won't always be what people will hear or what they will understand. This is something that most creators will definitely experience, because you're going, I have this particular story, I have this particular experience. Here you go, have a look. And then people go, that's totally not what I thought it was going to be. And it's not, you never take it as a negative thing. It's just different experiences, and that's something to be totally aware of. And last part is everyone's perception is different, and you have to be totally aware of this, and all this sort of ties together. So, next is the evolution of worlds.
So this relates back to like, you know, once you've like released your game or whatever you're making with your world, it's kind of out of your hands. It takes on a life of its own. But even before that, you can kind of steer the direction that the world is going into and kind of define what sort of world it is. So you can have,
So there's two major types that you have to be totally aware of. There is the open world type and the closed world type. These are definitely, there are some similarities, but there's actually a huge divide, and this is to do with the people that interact with them. So, for example, for those who are aware of what SCP is, does anyone know who SCP is? Yep, nice. SCP is absolutely fantastic. It's a community-driven, almost like horror, like Wikipedia of just these creatures that appear, these anomalies in the universe, right? But it's completely community driven. So it's a story, but it's driven by the people who look at it and who interact with it and etc. And then you have like Star Wars.
Which is a very interesting one because it is through Disney acquiring Star Wars, it has become like a really closed sort of world where, you know, Disney decides what's canon and what's not. Whereas before that, it was kind of like a bit more of an open thing where a lot of people contributed to it, and it kind of like sinks into the sort of not official but accepted canon.
Yeah. So you definitely gotta like choose. Basically, you basically gotta choose. It's a bit hard to be somewhere in between because people will either want to input or you can not allow it. And so if you really want to have community, and this, for example, the SCP one drives more community, you go with the open world. But if you want games like Star Wars or Skyrim or whatever, those sort of very closed stories and canons, then you got to go over there instead, which is just that separation.
So here's a couple of tools that I personally use to kind of like keep track of worlds and kind of help building them. So one of my absolute favorites is a thing called TiddlyWiki, which is kind of like, it's a wiki-style sort of web app where it's really minimalist. And it allows you to just like really quickly write links and connections, and you just put like little brackets around like your new proper noun that you've just invented, and later on you can like click on it and make a new thing, and it's really rapid to work with. Another thing that's really useful is a thing called MindJet, or like any kind of software that allows you to do mind maps, where this comes back to kind of keeping track of how far down the rabbit hole you've gone. Because these things really easily visualize. Like you've got, here's your world. Okay, here's like the creatures in it, and then you've got these branches of creatures, and you go down, and suddenly you see that there's like this huge branch there, and then there's nothing else. So it really helps you keep organized. And a really cool thing for inspiration is a website called GANbreeder, which is a machine learning-driven image generation software, where you decide kind of like the seeds that go into the image, and it will generate something that is kind of like based on that, but makes no sense. But it's a very cool thing to kind of see what you're doing. And finally, coffee. Coffee is good.
Multimedial worlds. This is quite an interesting one because it can be interpreted in different ways. But basically, the way that you portray the game in other platforms is very important. This is something that I am this is something that I look into and I spend a lot of time in. For those who know me on Twitter, like I tweet stuff all the time about worlds or stuff that I'm creating, or, you know. And one thing that is huge is branding and logos. It does depend on where you want to go, if you want to have an open or closed world. But for someone like me who has a very closed world, but it's also rather large, branding is incredibly important, even down to the t-shirts people wear. If you've got a particular shape or a particular crest or whatever it may be on someone's shirt, someone's going to be like, either I know what that is, that's cool, or what is that, and they ask a question. And so like it's insanely important. So like even down to like Harry Potter's houses or the houses, is that what it's called in Game of Thrones? That sort of thing. You see them somewhere, you know what they're from, that's branding, that's a logo.
And like a really cool thing about this is that like these things are in-universe things that you're taking outside of the universe, where like I do a lot of like cartography in my spare time, and one thing that I always do whenever I draw a map, it's like, who drew this map? Like, why are they drawing it? So you kind of get like this meta context for the actual physical thing that you're creating.
Yeah, so that sort of meta thing is really, really important. It's something that I think both of us definitely do a lot. Sometimes I might go on the Discord and I'll create a completely random Discord account and I'll pretend to like send some really cryptic messages. For those who are aware of ARGs, alternate reality games, my game Nycra has a huge ARG around it as well, which I've been like slowly sending spoilers about. And it's like, that is still branding, because people go, what is this? I want to be part of this, and then they try to, pick apart the puzzles and whatnot. So basically, yeah, how can you and others explore the world in other ways? Incredibly important, definitely remember that. And you can find us. Marc is old Loths.
Over there.
I am in Desga. And now we're going to go to questions, because we've got 5 minutes. No?
No, we don't.
No questions?
Thanks.
Oh, running behind time? Okay, well, that's
perfect.
no questions then. Sweet, I didn't get to use a laser.
Come find us if you have any questions.
There we go.
We'll be happy to talk about this.
Yeah, we're totally happy. I'm utterly open to being asked anything. Same with Marc.
Cool. Okay, get off the stage.
Yeah, okay. Bye.